I don't tell this story often because I still can't make sense of it. It happened in the summer of 2016 when my friends and I went camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains. There were 4 of us: me, my buddy Eric, his girlfriend Lisa, and her cousin Mark. We were all in our early 20s, looking for an adventure, but we got a little more than we bargained for. We set up camp deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. The first day was great. We hiked, fished, and sat around the fire telling stories. It was the second night when things got weird. Around midnight, we were sitting by the fire, drinking and joking, when Mark suddenly shushed us. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I thought he was messing with us, but then I heard it too. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and close. Too close. We all turned toward the sound, and that's when we saw him. A man, just standing at the edge of the firelight, half shrouded in darkness. He was tall, gaunt, and wore what looked like an old, tattered coat. His face was obscured by shadow, but his posture was strange, his head cocked slightly, like he was studying us. "Hey man, you okay?" Eric called out. The man took a step forward. The firelight hit his face, and I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were too wide, his grin too sharp. It didn't look natural. Then he spoke, and his voice, something about it was off, like 2 voices layered on top of each other. "The woods remember." Silence. None of us moved. None of us spoke. He just stood there, grinning at us. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We sat frozen for a moment, listening. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. Lisa was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" Mark shook his head. "A hiker, maybe? A lost camper?" "He wasn't carrying any gear," I pointed out. "No backpack, no flashlight. And did you hear his voice?" Nobody had an explanation, but we all agreed. We weren't sleeping out in the open that night. We hurried into our tents, but sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. Whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close. Too close. It was coming from right outside the tent. I reached over and shook Eric awake. He was about to whisper something when we heard a noise. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then, right outside the tent, the whispering stopped, and something pressed against the fabric. A hand. I stopped breathing. Eric grabbed my arm, his grip tight. We just sat there, waiting. Then, slowly, the hand slid down the fabric, leaving behind a streak of something dark. And then, silence. We stayed like that until dawn, too scared to move. When the sun finally came up, we unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The campsite looked normal, except for one thing. There were footprints circling our tents, and a long, dark streak in the dirt, leading back into the woods. We packed up and left immediately, hiking back to our car in record time. None of us spoke until we were miles away. But the weirdest part? When we got back to civilization, Mark decided to check the footage on his GoPro. He had set it up near the fire before we went to sleep, hoping to catch some cool nighttime footage of the forest. What we saw made my blood run cold. At around 3 a.m., the camera picked up movement. The man, the same one from the woods, emerged from the darkness. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, figures moved, their shapes distorted, their limbs too long, their eyes reflecting the firelight like animals. They stood around our tents, motionless, watching. Then, in unison, they turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees. The last thing captured before the battery died was the same voice from before, whispering softly, right into the microphone. The woods remember, and so do we. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know what they were, but I do know this. I'll never go back to those woods again. You don't have to believe me. Hell, I don't believe it myself. But I swear to you, every word I'm about to tell is true. It happened 5 years ago, and I've never set foot near the Lake of the Ozarks since. Not after what I saw. Not after what he did. I was out there on a solo camping trip, hoping for a peaceful weekend of fishing and getting away from the city. The lake was calm, barely a ripple on the surface. The sky painted in deep reds and purples as the sun set behind the tree line. I found a quiet spot by the water's edge, set up my tent, and got my fishing rod ready. The locals had told me that the fish bite best just after dusk, and I was eager to test my luck. That's when I first saw him. Down the shore, maybe 50 yards away, was another fisherman. He stood ankle-deep in the water, holding a long, old-fashioned fishing pole, the kind with a wooden handle, the kind you don't see much anymore. He was dressed in tattered overalls and a faded blue flannel shirt, the kind a man might have worn 50, 60 years ago. His hat, a wide-brimmed thing, frayed at the edges, cast a shadow over his face. But even in the dim light, I could see he wasn't moving, just standing there, still as a statue, staring at the water. I called out to him. No answer. I figured maybe he was just deep in thought, enjoying the solitude the same way I was. So I let him be. For the next hour, I fished. Every once in a while, I'd glance over at him, and he'd still be there, still motionless. I never saw him cast his line, never saw him reel anything in, just standing, waiting. Then I blinked, and he was gone. No splash, no footsteps in the gravel, just gone. A chill crept up my spine. I told myself I must have just lost sight of him. Maybe he'd wandered up the bank, back into the woods. But deep down, I knew better. The way he vanished, it wasn't right. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being stupid, letting my imagination run wild, so I stayed. By midnight, the moon hung high, casting silver light across the lake. The night was silent, the kind of deep, unnatural silence that makes your ears ring. No crickets, no owls, nothing. That's when I heard the splash. It came from the water just a few feet in front of me. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and swept the beam across the water. At first, there was nothing, just the dark ripples of the lake. Then, as the waves settled, I saw him. The fisherman. He was standing in the water again, but this time, closer. No more than 10 feet away. His face was still hidden under that damned hat, but now I could see his hands gripping the fishing pole. Twisted, gnarled hands, skin pale and bloated, like something that had spent too long in the water. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then he spoke. "You ain't supposed to be here." His voice was low, like the rasp of a drowning man, full of water and gravel. My mouth was dry. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The fisherman took a step closer. The water barely rippled around his legs, as if it weren't really touching him at all. "You took my spot," he whispered. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. His head tilted upward just enough for me to see beneath the brim of his hat. I wish to God I hadn't looked. His face, if you could call it that, was half rotted, flesh sloughing away to reveal blackened bone. One eye socket was empty, a hollow abyss, while the other held something far worse, a bulging yellowed eyeball, staring, seeing. His lips peeled back in a sick grin, revealing jagged, water-worn teeth. Then he lifted his fishing pole, and I saw what dangled from the end of his line. It wasn't a fish. It was a tongue. A human tongue, purple and swollen, hooked clean through like bait. I lost it. I turned and ran, tripping over my own feet, crashing through the trees like a madman. Behind me, I heard the splash of water, heavy footsteps, coming after me. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. I just remember bursting into the ranger station, screaming like a lunatic. They found my campsite. My gear was still there. My fishing rod, my tackle box. But my chair, the one I'd been sitting in, was gone. The rangers told me stories then, about the old fisherman who drowned in the lake back in the 1950s, how his body was never found, how campers sometimes saw him standing by the water, waiting. Some say he's still fishing. Some say he's looking for something else. I don't care what he wants. All I know is this: if you ever find yourself by the Lake of the Ozarks at night, and you see a lone fisherman standing in the water, don't look at him. Don't speak to him. And for the love of God, don't take his spot. I've always loved camping alone. The solitude, the fresh air, the way the stars burn bright without the interference of city lights. It's the kind of peace I crave. So in the summer of 2014, I packed my gear and drove up to the San Bernardino National Forest, eager for a weekend of silence. I picked a remote spot off a barely used trail, miles away from the nearest campsite. The sun was just beginning to set as I set up my tent and got a small fire going. There was something calming about the stillness, the way the wind barely rustled the trees. I made a simple meal, had a couple of beers, and crawled into my sleeping bag, expecting nothing but a deep, restful sleep. But sleep never came. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. Screaming. It wasn't just any scream. It was raw, piercing, filled with absolute agony, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. It came from deep in the woods, far yet unmistakably close enough that I could hear every horrifying detail. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scream lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if someone had cut it off. Silence followed. A thick, suffocating silence. I waited, straining my ears. No footsteps, no movement, no rustling leaves. Nothing. The forest had gone completely still. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I knew the smart thing to do was to stay inside my tent, to not get involved. But every instinct in me screamed to move, to do something. Someone out there needed help. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire had died down, casting long, eerie shadows around the clearing. The air felt different, thicker, heavier. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, but there was nothing but darkness. Then, another scream. Closer this time. It was unmistakably human but distorted, like someone's vocal cords had been stretched too far. My stomach knotted as I realized something wasn't right. I'd heard animal cries before, coyotes, mountain lions, but this wasn't that. This was human, and whoever was making that sound was suffering. I took a few hesitant steps toward the noise, my flashlight trembling in my grip. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. No response. The silence stretched again, pressing in on me like a living thing. I wanted to turn back, to pretend I'd heard nothing, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I moved deeper into the woods, my boots crunching softly against the dirt. The air smelled damp, earthy, but there was something else beneath it. A faint metallic scent, like rust or blood. Then I saw it. A figure, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. It stood unnaturally still, half hidden behind a tree. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a tall, thin body. I felt my breath hitch. Every part of me screamed to run, but I was frozen, unable to look away. Then, slowly, the figure moved. It shifted just enough for my flashlight to catch its face, or what should have been a face. The skin was stretched tight, pale and waxy, with hollow, gaping eyes that reflected the light in an unnatural way. Its mouth hung open, wider than any human jaw should be able to stretch. It wasn't screaming now, but I knew, somehow, I knew it was the source of the noise. And then it took a step toward me. I bolted. I didn't care about being quiet, didn't care about looking back. I just ran. The branches tore at my clothes, my skin, but I didn't stop. My campsite wasn't far, but every second felt like an eternity. I crashed into my tent, grabbing my car keys and yanking my bag over my shoulder in one frantic motion. I didn't bother packing up. I just needed to get out. I could still feel it behind me, watching, waiting. I jumped into my car, hands fumbling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow trail. Only when I hit the main road did I finally glance in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind me, musk and impenetrable, empty. But I knew better. Something was out there, and it was still screaming.